In 2003, Gisele Bündchen had reached a level of success almost no model ever had. Then, on a small plane, she suddenly could not breathe. A panic attack left her terrified of enclosed spaces, and soon the fear followed her home. During one of her lowest moments, she looked toward her balcony and thought about ending her life simply to make the feeling stop. She was in her early 20s, earning millions, dating one of Hollywood's biggest stars, and known for a confidence that seemed effortless. The public knew her as the Brazilian teenager who had beaten rejection and grown into fashion's new ideal. Behind that image, Gisele was living with anxiety she struggled to understand. Years later, she would describe that period as a crisis that forced her to change almost every part of how she lived. After the flight, the fear stopped feeling like a one-time event. Elevators and tunnels began triggering panic, and enclosed spaces became difficult because she never knew when it might start. Ordinary travel now carried another calculation: whether she could leave quickly if panic returned. The problem followed her beyond the plane, turning places she had once moved through without thinking into situations she began anticipating with dread. What unsettled her was how little sense it made. Gisele had always seen herself as an optimistic person. She was close to her family and had reached goals she once could barely have imagined. When anxiety appeared anyway, she felt guilty for having it. She would later describe wondering how she could possibly feel unhappy when her life contained so much that other people wanted. She kept much of it private and continued working. Panic could disappear long enough for a shoot, then return when she was alone or somewhere she felt unable to leave. To the people around her, nothing in the workday necessarily revealed how unpredictable the fear had become. Eventually, the panic reached a crisis point at home. During one especially severe period, she stood near the balcony of her apartment and had the thought that ending her life would also end the feeling. The thought frightened her enough to recognize how serious things had become. She did not act on it. She sought help and later wrote openly about the episode because it had forced her to confront something she had been trying to manage quietly. Long before that flight in 2003, Gisele had already learned how to leave home, enter unfamiliar rooms, absorb rejection, and continue to the next job. That instinct had helped build her career. To understand where it came from, the story goes back to Horizontina, Brazil, and a girl who had never expected fashion to become her life. Gisele Caroline Bündchen was born on July 20, 1980, in Horizontina, a small town in Rio Grande do Sul in southern Brazil. She grew up with 5 sisters, including her fraternal twin, Patricia, in a German-Brazilian family that described itself as middle class. Their home was busy, close-knit, and far removed from the fashion capitals that would later define much of her life. Her mother, Vânia, spent decades working at a bank. Her father, Valdir, held several jobs and later taught courses centered on self-awareness. Gisele has described her upbringing as modest but stable. There was little in her childhood that suggested she was being prepared for fame, and fashion was barely part of her world. She was much more interested in movement. Sports came naturally to her, especially volleyball, which she once considered pursuing seriously. She spent much of her childhood outdoors and grew up seeing herself as active rather than glamorous. Modeling was nowhere near the future she imagined for herself. Physically, though, she was hard to overlook. Gisele grew tall early and was thinner than many girls around her. At school, classmates teased her about the difference. One nickname was Olive Oil, the long, skinny character from Popeye. She has remembered feeling awkward in a body that seemed to attract attention before she had learned what to do with it. That discomfort stayed with her through adolescence. Looking older and taller than her classmates made her stand apart at an age when fitting in often feels more important than being distinctive. Nothing about that experience made her think those same features would one day become valuable. At home, she was simply one of 6 sisters. Outside it, her height increasingly made her noticeable. That gap between how ordinary she felt and how quickly strangers noticed her would soon become important when a routine trip away from Horizontina placed her in a completely unfamiliar world. The trip to Sao Paulo had begun as something ordinary. Gisele was there with a group of girls when a modeling scout noticed her while they were eating at McDonald's. She was 14 and knew almost nothing about the industry. What interested her most at first was the chance to travel and see places far beyond Horizontina. Soon after, she entered an elite modeling competition and began taking professional jobs. The change came quickly. At 14, she was already leaving Brazil for assignments, including a 3-month stay in Japan. Years later, after having children of her own, she looked back at that age differently. What had once felt like an adventure also meant learning to function on her own, long before she fully understood what that independence required. By 16, New York became the next step. She moved into a model apartment with other young women and arrived with very little English. One of the stories she later told from that period involved roommates teaching her a profanity and convincing her it was a normal greeting. She repeated it to people at her building and agency until someone finally explained what she had been saying. The mistake became a funny memory, but daily life was less simple. Gisele had to navigate a new city, unfamiliar agencies, castings, flights, and shared housing while learning the language around her. The work assumed a level of self-sufficiency that most teenagers never have to develop so quickly. The model apartments also exposed her to an adult world she had barely encountered at home. She remembered seeing drug use around some of the girls she lived with and feeling lonely during those years. There were practical things to master as well: cooking for herself, getting around unfamiliar cities, keeping track of jobs, and knowing where she needed to be next. Her family remained a constant presence from Brazil, but much of her working life now depended on decisions she had to make alone. The next stage would depend less on being discovered and more on whether fashion would keep giving her work. As Gisele moved deeper into international modeling, the criticism became much more specific. Clients told her that her nose was too big, her eyes were too small, and that her face would keep her off major magazine covers. She was still a teenager, hearing those judgments from people whose decisions could determine whether she worked. Her father gave her a response she never forgot. If someone complained about her nose, he told her to say that a big nose came with a big personality. It was a small piece of reassurance, but useful in a business where rejection could arrive several times in the same day. London was especially brutal. During her first show season there, Gisele went to 42 castings. Again and again, she walked into rooms, showed her book, and left without a job. Fashion was still dominated by a leaner, more androgynous aesthetic, and casting directors often saw her athletic build and stronger features as a poor fit. Then one booking finally came through. Alexander McQueen cast her for his upcoming London show. He was already known for presentations that could be confrontational, theatrical, and unpredictable, and landing a place in one of them carried far more weight than an ordinary runway job. For Gisele, it ended a long run of closed doors. She had finally been given a chance to walk for a designer people in fashion were watching closely. What happened backstage would make the opportunity far more frightening than she expected. Alexander McQueen presented his Spring-Summer 1998 collection, Untitled, in London on September 28, 1997. The show had originally been given the more provocative name, Golden Shower, before sponsors objected. Water remained central to the staging, and by the finale, rain was pouring across the runway as the models moved through it. Gisele was 17 and still new to London Fashion Week when she learned what one of her looks involved. Her chest would be uncovered beneath body paint. The idea frightened her, especially because she worried about photographs reaching her family back in Brazil. Backstage, the pressure became overwhelming and she began to cry. A makeup artist named Val stepped in and painted a white top across her chest, giving her more coverage before she walked. Gisele later remembered moving through the rain while trying to hold herself together, with the water making it impossible for anyone watching to tell that she had been crying. She completed the show. The booking put her in front of editors, photographers, and casting directors who could influence what came next. For the first time in London, people inside fashion were beginning to remember her name. More work followed. Her body, which had often been treated as a problem in castings, began attracting a different kind of interest as designers and magazines moved toward a more athletic and openly glamorous look. The change happened quickly enough that fashion soon attached a new label to her, the body. In July 1999, American Vogue put Gisele on its cover beneath the phrase, "The Return of the Sexy Model." She was 18 when the photographs were taken and turned 19 around the time the issue appeared. Inside, another feature used the phrase, "the return of the curve." Fashion was beginning to move away from the pale, waifish look that had dominated much of the decade, and Gisele arrived at exactly the moment editors were searching for something different. The attention changed the kind of work available to her. Major photographers wanted her. Designers booked her more regularly. Advertising campaigns followed. Within a few years, she had moved from fighting for runway jobs to becoming one of the names brands could build entire campaigns around. Victoria's Secret pushed that recognition far beyond fashion magazines. In 2000, Gisele signed a 5-year deal reported at $25 million. Her formal contract with the company lasted until 2007, and she appeared in its runway shows from 1999 through 2006. At the time, the televised show reached millions of viewers and helped make its best-known models celebrities in their own right. The company also placed her at the center of some of its most extravagant promotions. In 2000, she wore the red-hot fantasy bra, valued at $15 million. 5 years later, she wore another fantasy bra valued at $12.5 million. Those prices referred to the jewelry itself, though the publicity surrounding them strengthened the sense that Gisele had become one of the industry's most expensive names. By then, modeling was only one part of how she made money. She worked with fashion and beauty companies including Chanel, Dior, Louis Vuitton, Pantene, and other global brands. In Brazil, her business relationship with footwear company Grendene became especially valuable. The Ipanema sandal line bearing her name sold internationally, giving her income connected to product sales rather than relying entirely on shoots or runway bookings. Forbes began placing numbers around that success. In 2002, it identified her as the world's best-paid model. She remained at the top of its annual model earnings rankings through 2016, an unusually long run in an industry where new faces appear constantly. Kendall Jenner finally took first place in 2017, ending Gisele's streak at the top. Some years showed just how wide the gap had become. Forbes estimated that Gisele earned $47 million during the 12 months measured for its 2014 ranking before taxes and professional expenses. Around that period, the magazine calculated that she had earned roughly $386 million since 2001. The exact total she earned across her career is not public. The documented figures already show the scale. For more than a decade, she earned more annually than any other model Forbes was tracking at the time. Her sister Patricia became closely involved in managing the growing business. Other members of the Bündchen family also took roles around her career over time, giving Gisele a trusted circle as the number of contracts and commercial relationships increased. The teenager who had once arrived in New York with limited English now had an international business operating around her name. The work itself could still be relentless. A finished advertisement might come from hours of fittings, hair and makeup, travel, waiting, and shooting. Fashion weeks meant moving between cities while campaigns and other obligations continued around them. At her busiest, one assignment could finish just as preparation for another began. Soon, the strain became impossible to ignore. Gisele began dating Leonardo DiCaprio around 2000, just as both of their careers were drawing enormous attention. He was already one of Hollywood's biggest stars, while she was becoming one of fashion's most valuable names. Their relationship quickly became a fixture in celebrity coverage, and by the time they attended the 2005 Academy Awards together, they had spent years being photographed as one of the era's most glamorous couples. Away from those appearances, cigarettes, wine, and heavily sweetened coffee had become part of her routine. She was still moving constantly for work, but the habits she used to get through those days were becoming harder to ignore. As she began changing those habits, she also started questioning what she wanted from the relationship. Gisele later wrote that she felt increasingly alone as she tried to step away from the habits and lifestyle that had surrounded her for years. She cared about DiCaprio, but she was moving in a different direction and eventually accepted that the relationship no longer fit the life she wanted to build. They separated in 2005 after roughly 5 years together. The breakup became easy material for celebrity headlines, yet Gisele's explanation was quieter. She was trying to understand herself outside the pace that had shaped most of her adult life. Ending the relationship became one part of that larger reset. She began spending more time with family and became more protective of what she allowed into her daily routine. Her career continued, but the goal was no longer to accept every opportunity that appeared. She wanted enough space to feel present in the life she had worked so hard to create. Once the panic attacks became impossible to ignore, Gisele sought medical help. A doctor prescribed Xanax for the anxiety. She took the medication briefly, then became uneasy with the idea of relying on it and began looking for other ways to manage what she was experiencing. Her treatment shifted toward changes in routine, sleep, movement, and diet, with guidance from health professionals along the way. She stopped smoking and largely gave up alcohol. Caffeine and sugar disappeared from her daily routine for a period as well. A naturopath placed her on a restrictive temporary diet and encouraged regular sleep and exercise. Yoga became a daily practice, meditation became more consistent, and breathing exercises gave her something practical to focus on when anxiety started building. The transition was uncomfortable. She remembered severe headaches as her body adjusted to the sudden loss of caffeine and other habits she had relied on for years. Relief arrived gradually. There was no single morning when everything suddenly felt normal again. Over time, the attacks became less powerful, and she began trusting her body in situations that had previously frightened her. Food became one of the areas she approached most carefully. At different points, her diet became highly restrictive, especially during the early stages of changing her lifestyle. She later experimented with veganism and eventually reintroduced animal products after developing nutritional deficiencies. Her approach continued evolving rather than staying fixed around one philosophy. That history has sometimes been stretched into claims that she suffered from an eating disorder. Gisele has specifically said she never had anorexia, and she has never publicly disclosed a diagnosed eating disorder. Her experiences involved body pressure, restrictive eating at certain points, and an industry where appearance could determine employment. Those details carry enough weight without assigning her a diagnosis she has never claimed. Her interest in nature began early. She grew up surrounded by the rural landscape of southern Brazil, with gardens and outdoor life woven into everyday family routines. As her career gave her a larger platform, environmental causes became one of the areas where she chose to use it. Gisele and her family helped create the Agua Limpa project in Horizontina, which focused on protecting local water and restoring vegetation around waterways. She supported other conservation campaigns and, in 2009, became a United Nations Environment Program Goodwill Ambassador. Environmental work gave her opportunities that had little connection to posing for photographs. She could speak about forests, water, climate, and conservation without the conversation returning immediately to the measurements of her body or the clothes she was wearing. Wellness followed a similar path. What had started during a period of anxiety gradually became part of how she organized daily life. Sleep mattered more. Exercise became something she used for stability rather than preparation for a shoot. Time outdoors became something she actively protected. Gisele met Tom Brady on a blind date in December 2006. The connection moved quickly, but almost immediately, their relationship became more complicated than either of them had expected. About 2 months after they started seeing each other, Brady told her that his former girlfriend, actress Bridget Moynihan, was pregnant with his child. The news became public the following day. For Gisele, the timing was difficult. She was still getting to know Brady when their private relationship was suddenly tied to a pregnancy involving his former partner and intense tabloid attention. She considered what the situation would mean before deciding to stay. Brady's son, John, known as Jack, was born in 2007. Over time, Gisele became deeply involved in his life and later described him as her bonus child. The experience changed the family she had imagined for herself before she and Brady had even reached marriage. They married in February 2009 in a small ceremony in California. Their son Benjamin was born later that year, followed by their daughter Vivian in 2012. For the next several years, Gisele focused heavily on raising the children while Brady's football career continued at full speed. Her priorities around work changed with motherhood. She still accepted major campaigns and remained one of the industry's most valuable names, but the constant cycle of runway seasons became less appealing. She wanted to be available for mornings at home, meals with the children, and the routines that disappear quickly when work requires constant travel. In 2015, she walked her final runway show for Colchi in Sao Paulo. The decision ended one part of her career without ending modeling itself. Campaigns and commercial work continued, but she could be far more selective about when she left home and how long she stayed away. Professional football followed a rigid calendar of training, games, travel, recovery, and preparation. Brady also continued playing well beyond the age when most quarterbacks retire. Gisele supported his career while becoming increasingly open about wanting more balance at home. She worried about the physical toll of football as well. In interviews, she spoke about the repeated hits Brady absorbed and the long-term risks that came with them. Still, she maintained that the decision to continue playing belonged to him. By 2022, those separate priorities were becoming harder to reconcile. In an interview that year, Gisele spoke about spending years concentrating on the children and creating a stable home while Brady pursued football. She had reached a point where she wanted to return more fully to ambitions of her own. Those comments quickly became part of a much simpler story in the press. Brady announced his retirement in February 2022, then reversed the decision about 6 weeks later. When reports began suggesting that his return to football had caused the marriage to collapse, Gisele rejected that explanation. She called the idea that she had given him an ultimatum hurtful and made clear that 13 years of marriage could not be explained by one retirement decision. Even Brady's earlier controversies were pulled into theories about the marriage. Deflategate in 2015 had placed enormous scrutiny on him and brought another wave of attention around the family. Gisele never identified that period as the beginning of their marital problems, and there is no basis for treating it as one. Gisele and Brady announced their divorce on October 28, 2022, after 13 years as husband and wife. The divorce was finalized that same day in Florida. Their statements focused largely on their children and their intention to continue raising them together. Gisele addressed the end of the marriage more fully in a Vanity Fair interview the following year. She called the divorce the death of my dream. The phrase came from the future she had once pictured for herself. Her parents had remained married for decades, and she had expected to build something similarly permanent. Losing that future carried its own grief, even though she believed ending the marriage was the right decision. She also resisted the idea that one person had ruined everything. Her explanation centered on change. People meet at one point in their lives, continue developing, and sometimes discover that they are no longer moving in the same direction. That answer left little room for the kind of scandal celebrity coverage usually prefers. Gisele had known Joaquim Valente through jiu-jitsu training. He and his brothers operated a martial arts academy in Florida, and she had trained with them along with members of her family. After the divorce, photographs of Gisele and Joaquim spending time together triggered immediate speculation about the nature of their relationship. Gisele denied having an affair. She also criticized the assumption that a woman ending a marriage must have another man waiting somewhere in the background. Their relationship became romantic in 2023, after the divorce. They welcomed a child together in 2025. None of that establishes that the earlier affair rumors were true. By the time the relationship became public, those accusations had already been circulating for months. During a CBS Sunday Morning interview aired in September 2023, she reflected on the changes that had followed the divorce and said that before, she had been more surviving, while now she felt she was living. What changed most was the amount of choice she seemed willing to claim for herself. For years, large parts of her life had been organized around external schedules, castings, shoots, runway seasons, school calendars, and football seasons. By her 40s, she had enough professional security to decide where work fit, rather than letting work decide everything else. Her post-divorce life reflected that shift. She continued modeling, publishing, training, and spending time with family without trying to recreate the pace that had dominated her 20s. Food remained part of that newer chapter of her life. In 2024, she published Nourish, a cookbook centered on meals she prepared for herself and her family. It reflected a more flexible approach than some of the restrictive routines she had followed during the height of her anxiety. By then, she seemed less interested in making her life fit a clean public story. For most of her career, Gisele Bündchen was defined by whatever the world happened to see at the time. She was the awkward girl who grew too tall too quickly, the young model casting directors rejected, the face Vogue used to announce a new beauty ideal, and eventually the woman whose name became valuable enough to exist far beyond the runway. Each version looked complete while it lasted. The same pattern followed her into the years after modeling stopped controlling most of her schedule. Motherhood changed her priorities. Her marriage changed over time. Divorce forced another adjustment. Even the wellness routine people came to associate so strongly with her continued evolving as she learned what actually worked for her. There is no clean point where Gisele finally figured everything out. Her life after the runway has kept changing, just as the years before it did. Perhaps that is the part of her story the polished photographs could never capture. Fashion spent decades freezing Gisele into whatever image it needed from her at that moment. She kept moving beyond each one. The girl once told she would never make a magazine cover eventually became one of the most recognizable women in the world. Learning who she wanted to be when nobody else was deciding the image took much longer.